So in our last video, we stained this guitar. And now, of course, we need to talk about how to put the top coat on it and actually finish it by hand. So last time, I asked you guys to choose between the satin finish and the gloss finish. So thanks to those of you who voted. Some of you, of course, went for the gloss, some went for the satin, and a few of you said, do both. Cheaters. Don't worry though, I'm not mad. I like you guys. You're great listeners. And you never interrupt me. So, we're gonna do both. I'm gonna go ahead and put the gloss polyurethane on the top of the guitar. That's this part. I know it's not on top when I hold it like this. The top of the guitar. And we're gonna do the sides and back in the satin. So of course this adds a little bit to the amount of content that we have to cover. And originally I was going to do the entire application and the buffing or polishing or whatever else is associated with it in one video. But since we're doing two now, I'm going to cover the application process for each in this video. They're very, very similar, but still, I got to do them both anyway, so I might as well show you real quick. And then in the subsequent video, we will be covering how to polish out your gloss rather, to a gloss finish, and how to rub out the satin so that it keeps a nice satin finish. I've noticed through the comments that a few of you are a little bit daunted by the gloss finish, or the rub-on gloss finish at least, and you're worried that you won't be able to achieve a high gloss. You will. It's not that difficult. It requires a little bit more work. There's a little bit of intricacy to the polishing sometimes, but really it shouldn't be a problem. So don't be scared of the gloss finish. We'll cover now one way of doing it, but there's more than one. So really it's just about the effort that you put into it. So I'm sure you've all heard the expression, there's more than one way to skin a cat. I can just imagine what you're thinking if you're too young to know that one. Anyway, my point is, there's more than one way to apply your finish. Now the recommended way to apply a wipe-on finish is simply by taking a rag and wiping it on. You can thin these down with mineral spirits if you so choose. I'm gonna do my first coat with full strength, the hell is this stuff called? Poly. And then for my second coat, when I want it to lay out a little more evenly, no, that's not really the word, a little easier, a little thinner, I'm going to thin it down. But like I said, the recommended way is to simply take a cloth and wipe it on. So it would be logical for me to show you that method, but that's kind of boring. Another option, if you've got a slightly uneven surface and you're looking for a little bit more build, is to use a foam brush. A foam brush will lay it on heavier than a rub-on finish with a cloth will. There are, of course, other ways of doing it as well. You can use sandpaper to rub it on. Sandpaper will remove some wood particles. If you use fine sandpaper, they will be fine particles, and it will mix with the poly and create a filler of sorts. So if you've got a little bit of porosity to your wood and you're looking to get a mirror finish and you want to smooth it out, you can use sandpaper to do that. I'm going to use something in between sandpaper and the cloth, and part of the reason I'm doing it is because it's exactly what I used in the last video, and I like continuity. So I'm going to be using some 4-0 or quadruple aught or whatever the hell you call it, steel wool. Anyway, I'm going to be using the steel wool and some of the poly at full strength, which I happen to have put in my coffee cup, because I breathe in enough of this stuff that I'm sure I could drink it and it really wouldn't matter at this point. To get started, there's really no science that, well, I'm sure there's plenty of science to it, but there's really not much to note on this. You simply put some poly on your steel wool, put it on the surface of the guitar, and start rubbing it in. Now, a nice thing about these rub-on finishes is that you don't have to actually mask off your cavities like you would with a spray, unless you're really clumsy. You really shouldn't be getting it in there. Now, when you're rubbing on your first coat, you'll see little bubbles in there. It really doesn't matter what you use to apply it, they will almost always be there. You're going to want to try and get rid of those. And the way you do that is simply by going over it more times. So if you're using the foam brush, which I find gives some of the more pronounced bubbles originally, you just brush it back and forth. This is not like a brushing lacquer. It doesn't flash off immediately. So you really don't have to worry about it. You can go over it a couple times. It's not one of those try and load up your brush and lay it on in one stroke things. So a little easier to work with in that case. Ooh, shiny. Now I mentioned that on more porous woods you might want to put on a thicker layer using the foam brush. Now there is brush-on poly, and it's designed for that. The white bond poly I find works just as well for it. It's really a matter of preference. I find the white bond poly more versatile personally, but that's not really the point. Depth of finish can affect the level of gloss that you get. Ooh, that sounds important. It is important, to some extent at least. You can actually get a gloss finish with satin polyurethane. This stuff right here, I've done it. Gloss finish. And it didn't really take much polishing. Usually if you want to make a satin or a matte turn glossy, you have to polish the heck out of it. But if you put that stuff on thick enough, it kind of glosses up. People occasionally tell me that they're putting on a satin clear coat, an enamel spray can or something, and it's coming out way too glossy and they don't know why. Well, you probably put it on there too thick. It was really wet and it continued to look kind of wet afterward. So for your gloss, that's fine. But when you go to put on your satin, if you really want to make sure that it stays satin, you don't want to be putting it on too thick. There's also the matter of tone. Now people love to argue with me about this, but I'm telling you, the finish can affect your tone. Yes, I know the electrical engineers are pulling out their pitchforks right now, like, it's all about the circuit, it's all about the circuit. Well, the pickups pick up the vibration of the strings. From there, maybe it is all about the circuit, but your wood choices, the weight of your guitar, chambering, and your finish affect how the strings vibrate, and that's how it affects your tone. Why am I broaching this topic, you ask? Well, in theory, the thicker your finish is, the more it's going to affect your tone. A thicker finish is going to harden, probably to harder than the wood is, I would imagine, and basically deaden it a little more. So sometimes that's what you're looking for, sometimes it's not. Be aware of this when you're putting on your finish. You can get a gloss finish without going real thick, and that's what I'm doing. I've got a very thin rubbed on first coat. I'm going to have an even thinner second coat, and because my wood wasn't very porous, shouldn't be a problem. I'll have a nice smooth gloss finish when I'm done. So if you're looking to alter the tone of your wood as little as possible, you want to keep that finish relatively thin. So because I'm going for the thin finish, like I mentioned, I'm now going to let that dry completely. And tomorrow, I'm going to come back and scuff it up lightly, make sure it's good and smooth before I put on the thin second coat. If I were finishing something else where I didn't need a thin finish, like a jewelry box or something, I would wait a few minutes, maybe half an hour, and then I would go ahead and put on a second coat now. Then I would let that harden completely, sand it, and put on one or two thin finishing coats. But for the purposes of this one, it's now time to move on to the satin. So I've got some satin poly in my cup now. And in an effort to not bore you and to show you more than one method, I'm going to apply this one with the rag. So I'm putting this on very light because I want to make sure I don't have any dripping down over the edges onto the front of the guitar. I'm going to start in the middle and just rub on a nice light coat of this. Now you can actually use this stuff as a sealer. I know sealers are something that confuses a lot of people. You can use this stuff to seal the wood, but, and that's kind of what we're doing here, but then you need a little more of it. What I'm doing, the wood is pretty darn smooth. I don't really have to worry about the sealer too much, but my first coat is almost going to act like a sealer, and then my second coat is going to act like my top coat. And now we wait. Ooh, considerably less shiny. And not quite even yet because it hasn't dried. Alright guys, it's been a couple days now and our poly is dry. It's time to start prepping for our next coat. Now in order to get the next coat to stick, we need to sand the first coat. Basically we just need to scratch up the surface so that the next layer has something to grab onto. So the paper I'm using is an 800 grit. Make sure that you're using no load paper. Okay, you use wet dry if you want, but don't use the cutting wood sandpaper. You're not sanding wood anymore. You know what I mean. You're sanding the finish. So get yourself a no load paper. If you try and sand your finish with standard wood sanding sandpaper, it's just going to jam up. It's going to get, I think they call it seeding, little crap all over it, and it's going to scratch the surface. So like I said, all we really have to do here is scratch up the surface so that the next layer has something to bond to. You want to try and keep it smooth for this. That's why I'm using 800 grit. The smoother your surface is now, the smoother your next coat will go on. However, don't take that to the extreme and go in there with 2000 grit or something like that, because that's going to be so smooth that your next layer might not bond properly. This also affords us the opportunity to take out any dust and imperfections that we have in here. So if you put a run into it when you were putting your first coat on, or if, like mine, some dust dried on the surface, you can sand that out now. You could also quite easily get away with using steel wool to scuff the surface of your guitar here. It doesn't have the leveling properties of sandpaper, it won't flatten things out, but it certainly accomplishes the main task, which is to scratch up the surface so that the next layer will stick. So now we're going to move on to our second coat. And I believe I mentioned this previously, but we're going to put it on a little thinner this time. We're going to actually thin it down a little bit. The first coat, if you're worried about getting gloss, that's the one that you want to put on heavier. And then your next coat or subsequent coats, if you need more than two, can go on lighter. So I think I might have mentioned earlier, and I'm too lazy to go back through the footage and check for sure, but I'm pretty sure I said if you put your satin on too thick, it can get kind of glossy. So to illustrate this point, I'm going to show you my box. This box. Alright, that got weird. Anyway, I just wanted to demonstrate something for you. I didn't film the process because I'm filming the process already. But just to show you what can happen, this I put on as a satin. That is satin poly. And I put it on the way that I would put on a gloss. And then I polished it using the polishing techniques that I use for gloss. And as you can probably see, it's pretty glossy. So you can essentially get yourself a gloss finish using satin. This piece of wood isn't very flat, as you can tell. It's kind of wavy. I kind of like it that way. Anyway, yeah, you can get yourself a gloss if you use satin incorrectly. Alright, so now we're going to mix up our next coat. I've got my poly here. I'm starting with the gloss again. And I'm going to be mixing it in my former coffee cup, which I probably won't be using again. Certainly not today, at least. And finally, my solvent for thinning. I'm not going to thin it much. So, you can, especially if your surface is very smooth, but this has a curve to it at some point. Like, it's not that it's not smooth, but it's got the cutaway stuff. It's at a bit of an angle, and if I thin my poly too much, it'll just run. So I'm going to thin it a little bit. What I'm using here is just record salt, paint thinner. I'm using paint thinner. You can use mineral spirits or paint thinner, basically, for this stuff. It doesn't really matter which. It's all going to accomplish the same thing. So you just need something that's going to cut down the viscosity. Keep in mind when you're thinning things that some different chemicals and solvents have different, what we call flash off time, different drying times, and they will affect how fast your poly or paint or whatever it is you're thinning dries. So if I had to guess, I would say that I'm thinning it by about 20%. And I do have to guess because I didn't measure it. But thinning is just basically a matter of personal preference. If you want it thinner, make it thinner. I use the that looks about right method, but you can of course be much more clinical with it if you choose. And it's time to get started. So this stuff, because it's thinner, is going to be a little runnier, a little, I don't want to say wetter, but I'm going to, a little wetter. So you really have to be careful about applying it and make sure it's on there thin. You do not have to thin your poly if you don't want to. So if you'd rather work with it at the same consistency as before, just ignore all that crap and go ahead and do it. Alright, another thing to note, for lack of a better term, some woods are thirstier than others. At least that's what we call it. Which means that they basically soak up a whole lot of your product. So if it doesn't look good after the second coat, do a third one. Scuff it down a little bit like we just did, do a third one. Maybe if it really didn't look good after the first coat, put the second coat on a little heavier, a little thicker, and don't thin it. Okay? The idea here is that some woods have a more open grain, and because of the finishing style that we used on this, where we didn't use a filler or a sealer, you're going to possibly run into an issue where your wood will absorb a lot of your material. So just don't panic, you'll get there. So you may have noticed from that seemingly pointless footage of me actually applying the finish that I did it a little differently than the first coat. On the first one, I was rubbing it in, well, this one I used a cloth, last time I used steel wool, but that's not really what I'm getting at. Last time I was rubbing it around in circles and really pushing it into the wood and then leaving a layer on top after that. Now, because I'm intending this to be my last coat, I'm more concerned with it going on smooth. I no longer have to worry about it getting into the wood because I've already sealed it with my first coat. It might take you more than one to do that, but I did it in one. No, I'm not saying that makes me better than you. That's just what happened. Alright, so that's gone on there pretty smooth. Looks pretty good. And yeah, hopefully when it's finished drying it will continue to look good and polishing won't be a huge issue for us. So there you have it. I'm not going to waste your time with footage of me putting on the satin because it goes on the same way that the gloss does anyway. So that's about it for now. In our next video we'll cover the polishing methods for both. I'm sure I've said that like 6 times now, so my apologies for being redundant. So thanks for watching. Feel free to subscribe so I can convince my mother that people actually like me. And see you next time. Have a good one.